If you can afford this, I'll quit right now." The words cut clean through the soft jazz humming in the background, sharp enough to make a woman near the perfume counter pause mid-spray and a man in a tailored suit glance up from his phone. And for a brief second, the entire luxury store seemed to hold its breath under the warm glow of chandelier light reflecting off glass and polished chrome as Daniel Brooks leaned casually against the counter, his smile thin, practiced, certain, the kind of smile built from years of believing he could read people the moment they walked through the door. And in front of him stood Ava Johnson, her gray cleaning uniform slightly creased at the sleeves, a faint scent of lemon polish still clinging to her hands, her posture straight but unassuming, like she had long ago learned how to exist without drawing attention, how to move through rooms designed for people who never saw her. Yet her eyes did not drop, not even for a second. They stayed level, steady, absorbing every flicker of amusement, every sideways glance, every quiet judgment forming in the air around her as a few customers exchanged smirks, and someone near the register let out a soft laugh that wasn't loud enough to be called cruel, but carried enough weight to settle into the space between them. Daniel tapping the glass case lightly with one finger, as if to emphasize the number printed beside the item inside, $12,000. His voice lowering just enough to feel personal, while still loud enough for others to hear. "Go ahead," he added, tilting his head. "Prove me wrong." And the words hung there, suspended, like a challenge no one expected to be answered. But Ava didn't move right away, didn't rush, didn't defend herself. Instead, she took one quiet breath, the kind that barely lifted her shoulders, the kind that steadied something deeper than nerves. And then she stepped forward, her shoes making the faintest sound against the marble floor, a soft, almost unnoticeable rhythm that contrasted with the tension, tightening the room. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, even, untouched by the laughter or the stares. "I'll take everything on this shelf," she said. And for a moment it didn't register, not fully, not until Daniel let out a short, incredulous chuckle, shaking his head like he had just heard the punchline to a joke only he understood, the people nearby leaning in slightly now, curiosity replacing amusement, phones subtly shifting in hands, attention sharpening as if something unexpected had just entered the script. And still Ava didn't look at them, didn't look at Daniel either, her focus settling on the counter as she reached into her pocket with slow, deliberate precision, the overhead lights catching the movement, reflecting off the smooth surface as she placed a single black card onto the glass. And suddenly the laughter stopped, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that the silence felt heavier than before, thicker, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. And Daniel's smile faltered just slightly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, his hand hovering above the register as if unsure whether to proceed or dismiss it all as some elaborate misunderstanding. But the room had already shifted, something subtle and irreversible, and for the first time since he spoke, Daniel wasn't entirely in control of what happened next. The card sat there, perfectly still against the glass, its matte black surface swallowing the light instead of reflecting it. And for a moment no one moved, not the cashier, not the customers, not even Daniel, whose fingers hovered just above the register keys as if pressing them might confirm something he was not ready to face. Then finally he let out a short breath, the kind people use when they are about to prove a point, and reached forward, picking up the card between two fingers like it might disappear if he held it too firmly, turning it slightly, checking for anything that might explain it, a logo, a mark, a sign that this was some kind of trick. But there was nothing, just the quiet weight of something that did not need to introduce itself, and he slid it into the reader with a faint click that sounded louder than it should have in the silence, the machine lighting up, a soft blue glow spreading across the counter as numbers began to process, and somewhere behind them a woman shifted her weight, the faint creak of her heel echoing like a countdown, while another customer lowered his phone just slightly, unsure now whether he was watching something embarrassing or something important. And Ava stood there without moving, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression unchanged, not defiant, not nervous, just present, as if she had already accepted whatever outcome might come next. And Daniel glanced up at her briefly, searching her face for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that would restore the balance he was used to, but found nothing, Only that same quiet steadiness that refused to give him anything to push against. And the machine let out a soft beep. Then another, slower this time. Like it was thinking, like it was deciding. And the screen flickered, the progress bar pausing halfway before continuing, and Daniel forced a small smile, shaking his head as he looked back at the display. These things take a minute, he muttered, though no one had asked, though no one had spoken, and the seconds stretched, long enough for the air to feel heavier, for the earlier laughter to fade completely into something closer to anticipation, and then the tone changed, a sharper sound, a confirmation chime that cut clean through the quiet, and the word approved flashed across the screen in bold letters, bright and undeniable, and for a split second nothing happened, as if the room itself needed time to catch up. And then the system stuttered, the screen refreshing again, lines of information scrolling too quickly to read, until suddenly it stopped on a message that did not belong on a sales terminal. Not here, not in front of customers. A message that made Daniel's hand freeze where it rested on the counter, his breath catching just slightly as his eyes locked onto the screen. The words simple, official, impossible to ignore. And without meaning to, he read them again, slower this time, as if that might change them, but it did not. And the silence that followed was no longer casual, no longer curious. It was absolute, the kind of silence that strips away assumptions, that leaves only truth standing in the center of the room. And Daniel did not look at Ava right away, because something inside him already knew that when he did, everything he thought he understood about this moment would shift completely. Daniel's throat tightened as the message remained on the screen, unmoving, unblinking, like it had nothing to prove and no reason to disappear, and the words seemed louder now in the silence even though they made no sound at all. Owner access verified, a phrase that did not belong in a retail transaction, a phrase that belonged somewhere higher, somewhere far beyond the polished floors and curated displays of this store, and slowly, almost carefully, Daniel lifted his eyes from the screen to Ava, as if looking too quickly might break whatever fragile explanation he was trying to build in his mind. But Ava had not changed, not her posture, not her expression. She stood exactly as she had before, calm, grounded, as if this moment was not a surprise to her, but a quiet confirmation of something already known, and that steadiness unsettled him more than anything else, because it left no room for him to reinterpret what was happening, no space to reduce it into something manageable. And behind him, a soft murmur began to form, not laughter this time, but something lower, more uncertain, as customers exchanged glances, their earlier amusement dissolving into something closer to realization. And one of the associates near the fitting rooms took a hesitant step forward, eyes flicking between Daniel and the screen, unsure whether to intervene or remain invisible, while Daniel's hand slowly withdrew from the counter, as if the surface itself had become unfamiliar, and he cleared his throat, the sound dry, controlled, but lacking the confidence it held just moments before. There must be some kind of system error, he said, though the words did not carry the authority they once did, and even as he spoke them, he knew they did not fit, not with the clean approval, not with the clarity of the message, not with the way everything had aligned too precisely to be dismissed. And Ava finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a small shift of her hand as she reached toward the card reader and gently removed her card, the motion quiet but decisive, and the machine gave one last soft tone as if acknowledging the end of the transaction. And for a brief second, Daniel noticed the details he had ignored before, the way she handled the card with familiarity, the absence of hesitation, the absence of performance, and it struck him that she had never been trying to prove anything at all, not to him, not to anyone in the room. She had simply responded, and that realization landed heavier than the message on the screen, because it exposed something deeper than a mistake. It revealed a pattern, a way of seeing that had led him here, and the store, once filled with the quiet confidence of luxury, now felt different, the air thinner, the space sharper, every reflection in the glass cases carrying a new weight. And Daniel straightened slightly, instinct pulling him back toward control, toward recovery. But the words he needed did not come, not in the way he expected, and instead he found himself standing in a silence he could not reshape, watching as Ava rested her hand lightly on the edge of the counter, her gaze meeting his for the first time since the approval, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something far more unsettling, a quiet clarity that asked nothing and explained everything at once. And in that moment, Daniel understood that whatever came next would not be about the purchase, it would be about what he had already revealed. Daniel's lips parted slightly as if he was about to speak, but no words came out at first, only a quiet breath that felt heavier than it should have, and he shifted his weight subtly behind the counter, trying to reclaim the posture he had worn so effortlessly just minutes ago. But it no longer fit the moment, not with the screen still glowing faintly between them, not with the room now watching in a different way, and he forced a small, controlled smile, one that usually worked, one that usually smoothed things over. "Miss Johnson, right?" he said, his voice softer now, measured, carefully respectful, as if adjusting tone alone could undo what had already been said, and Ava did not immediately respond, her gaze steady, her silence not cold but deliberate, like she was allowing him the space to hear himself. And that silence stretched just long enough for the faint hum of the store's lighting to become noticeable, for the distant sound of a register opening somewhere else to echo faintly, grounding the moment in something real while everything else felt suspended. And Daniel continued, clearing his throat again. "There must have been a misunderstanding earlier," he added, each word chosen with precision, each one placed like a step on uncertain ground. And Ava finally spoke, her voice calm, even, without a trace of tension. "There was no misunderstanding," she said, and the simplicity of the sentence landed harder than anything louder could have, because it did not accuse, it did not explain, it simply existed as truth. And Daniel's expression tightened just slightly, the corners of his smile fading as he processed that response. And for the first time he glanced around the store, noticing the way the employees had slowed their movements, the way the customers were no longer pretending not to listen, the subtle shift in attention that had turned this private exchange into something quietly public. And he straightened again, instinctively trying to re-establish control of the environment. "Of course," he said quickly, nodding once. "Of course, I apologize if anything I said came across the wrong way." But even as he spoke, the phrasing felt thin, insufficient, like it was built for a different kind of moment, one where appearances mattered more than substance. And Ava tilted her head just slightly, not dismissive, not confrontational, but thoughtful, as if considering the weight of his words rather than their surface. And then she reached out, her fingertips brushing lightly against the glass counter, tracing the edge where the luxury items were displayed, the same items that had been used as a measure of worth just moments ago. And she looked at them briefly before returning her gaze to Daniel. "You did not misunderstand me," she said quietly, "and I did not misunderstand you." And the distinction settled into the air with quiet finality, leaving no room for reinterpretation, no space to retreat into ambiguity. And Daniel felt it, that shift, that narrowing of options, the realization that this was no longer about correcting a mistake, but about confronting something he could not easily frame or dismiss. And he nodded again, slower this time, the movement less certain, his eyes dropping briefly to the counter before lifting back to hers. And in that moment, the store did not feel like his domain anymore, not like a place where he set the tone and controlled the narrative. It felt like a space where something had been revealed, something that could not be unseen, and Ava's presence within it was no longer quiet or invisible. It was steady, undeniable, and entirely her own. The air in the store felt different now, no longer polished and effortless but tight, like something invisible had shifted just beneath the surface. And Daniel could feel it in the way people stood a little straighter, in the way conversations that once filled the space had quietly disappeared, leaving only the soft hum of overhead lights and the faint sound of fabric brushing as someone adjusted their sleeve. And he forced himself to move, to do something, reaching toward the register again, even though the transaction had already been completed, as if repeating the motion might restore some sense of normalcy. "Let me finalize the packaging for you," he said, his voice careful, controlled, but lacking the ease it once carried. And Ava watched him for a moment before responding, her gaze not unkind, not distant, just steady. "Take your time," she said, and the words were simple, yet they carried a weight that made the space between them feel even more defined. And Daniel nodded quickly, turning to retrieve a box from beneath the counter, his movements precise but slightly slower than before, as if he were suddenly aware of every gesture, every sound, the faint slide of cardboard against the shelf, the soft click as he opened it, the way the tissue paper rustled as he placed it inside. Details he had performed hundreds of times without thought now unfolding with deliberate care, and behind him. One of the associates approached cautiously, stopping just short of the counter, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Do you need assistance?" she asked, and Daniel shook his head without turning. "I have it handled," he replied, though the words sounded more like reassurance to himself than to her, and she stepped back again, blending into the background, but not entirely. Not the way she had before, because now everyone was aware. Everyone was present in a way that could not be undone, and as Daniel folded the tissue paper over the item, he became acutely aware of the contrast, the way minutes earlier this same object had been used as a boundary, a line drawn to separate who belonged and who did not, and now it sat quietly in his hands, stripped of that meaning, reduced to what it actually was, just an object, nothing more. And he closed the box gently, placing the lid on with a soft press, aligning the edges carefully before sliding it across the counter toward Ava, his hands lingering there for just a second longer than necessary, as if unsure whether to let go. And when he finally did, he straightened slowly, meeting her eyes again, and this time there was no attempt to mask what he felt, no practiced expression, just a quiet recognition settling in, and Ava accepted the box with both hands. Not hurried, not hesitant, and for a brief moment their hands were close enough that he could see the faint lines on her fingers, the subtle marks of someone who worked, someone who moved through spaces others overlooked, and yet stood here now with a presence that could not be ignored, and she gave a small nod, not of approval, not of dismissal, but of acknowledgement, and as she turned slightly, preparing to step away from the counter, Daniel felt something shift again, not in the room this time, but within himself. A realization that the moment was not ending the way he had expected, not with a resolution he could define or control, but with something far more unsettling, the understanding that what had been revealed would remain, long after the transaction was complete, long after the store returned to its usual rhythm, and he watched as Ava began to walk toward the exit, her steps steady, unhurried, and the quiet that followed her was not empty. It was full, carrying with it everything that had just taken place, everything that could not be undone. The glass doors at the front of the store slid open with a soft whisper as Ava approached, and for a moment the outside light spilled in, cooler, sharper, cutting through the warm glow of the showroom and stretching long reflections across the polished floor, and she paused just before stepping through, not hesitating, not unsure, just still, as if allowing the air to settle around her, the box resting lightly in her hands, its weight insignificant compared to everything that had just unfolded. And behind her the store remained quiet, not frozen but subdued, like a space that had just witnessed something it could not fully process. And Daniel stood where she had left him, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders slightly lowered, his gaze fixed on the doorway as if he expected something more, something to complete the moment. But nothing came, no dramatic words, no final gesture, just the quiet presence of a woman who had already said everything without needing to raise her voice. And Ava stepped forward, crossing the threshold as the doors parted fully, the faint sound of the city outside rising to meet her, distant traffic, a passing conversation, life continuing without pause. And yet inside, time felt slower, stretched thin across the silence she left behind, and Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, his hand resting lightly on the counter as he looked down for a moment, noticing the faint imprint where the card had been placed, a small, almost invisible detail, but one that now felt impossible to ignore, and he ran his fingers across the surface without thinking, as if trying to smooth it out, to erase the moment. But the memory did not fade. It settled deeper, sharper, and he straightened again, turning slightly as he became aware of the eyes still lingering around him, not openly staring, not judging aloud, but present, aware. And that awareness pressed in from all sides, quiet but undeniable, and one of the associates shifted near the display wall, adjusting a row of items that did not need adjusting, her movements careful, controlled, while another customer cleared his throat softly and stepped away, breaking the stillness in small, subtle ways, and Daniel nodded once, almost to himself, as if acknowledging something he could not yet put into words, and he moved behind the counter again, his steps slower now, less certain, the rhythm of his work no longer automatic, and outside, Ava continued down the sidewalk, her pace steady, the city unfolding around her in familiar patterns, the hum of traffic, the warmth of sunlight against the buildings, reflections dancing across glass windows as she passed, and she did not look back, not once, because there was nothing behind her that required her attention anymore, nothing that needed revisiting, and the store doors closed gently behind her with a soft click, sealing the space she had just left, but not the impact of what had happened inside, because that remained, lingering in the air, in the silence, in the quiet. Shift of perspective that no one in that room could fully ignore, not even Daniel, who stood there now, no longer certain of the boundaries he once believed were so clear. The door had barely settled back into place when the store's system chimed again, a soft internal notification that did not belong to customers or purchases, a tone reserved for management access, and Daniel's head turned instinctively toward the terminal as the screen flickered once more, pulling his attention back with a quiet insistence he could not ignore, and he stepped closer, slower this time, as if approaching something that had already proven it could change everything in a single moment, and the message expanded across the display, no longer just a transaction confirmation, but a profile interface, clean, minimal, unmistakably corporate. And there it was again, her name, Ava Johnson, but now it carried weight, layers, authority that stretched far beyond the walls of this store, and beneath it, a designation that made his chest tighten slightly, executive ownership tier. And the realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, piece by piece, connecting fragments he had not even known were missing the way. She observed the layout when she walked in, the way she spoke without hesitation, the absence of any need to prove herself, and behind him, one of the associates took a small step forward, unable to hold back the question any longer. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly, but Daniel did not answer immediately, his eyes still locked on the screen, scanning details he had no authority to question yet could not look away from. And then another line appeared, subtle but final, "Parent company. Authorization confirmed," and the words settled into him with a clarity that stripped away any remaining doubt. This was not just a customer, not just someone with money. This was someone above him, above this store, above the structure he had believed defined the space. And he felt it then, not as panic, not as fear, but as something heavier, something more grounded, the unmistakable weight of understanding. And he leaned back slightly, his hand resting against the edge of the counter as he exhaled slowly, the breath steady but deeper than before, and the store around him remained quiet, not because people were waiting for an explanation, but because something had already been understood without words. And Daniel finally looked up, not at the door this time, not at the exit she had walked through, but at the reflection in the glass case in front of him, his own face staring back, composed but changed, the confidence still there but reshaped, stripped of something it once carried. Without question, and in that reflection he saw the moment again, not as it felt when it happened, but as it truly was, a line spoken too easily, a judgment made too quickly, and a truth revealed without resistance. And he closed his eyes for a brief second, not to escape it, but to accept it, because there was no undoing what had already been said, no rewriting the version of himself that had stood there minutes ago. And when he opened them again, the store looked the same, the lights still warm, the displays still perfect, the customers beginning to move again in small, cautious ways, but the meaning of the space had shifted, permanently, quietly, and Daniel straightened once more, not to reclaim control, but to stand in the reality that had just been revealed, understanding now that the moment was never about the purchase, it was about what had been exposed in the space between two people, and that truth would remain long after the system cleared the screen and the store returned to its rhythm. The screen dimmed slowly as the system reset, the corporate interface disappearing as quietly as it had appeared, leaving behind the familiar sales display, clean and neutral, as if nothing unusual had happened. But the shift it created did not fade with it. It lingered, embedded in the posture of every employee, In the careful way voices returned, softer now, measured, and Daniel stood still for a moment longer before moving, his hand lifting from the counter as he stepped out from behind it. Something he rarely did unless necessary, his pace steady but deliberate as he walked toward the front of the store, each step echoing faintly against the marble, not rushed, not hesitant, just purposeful, and the automatic doors ahead reflected his figure as he approached, the glass catching the overhead lights and blending them with the daylight outside, creating a thin, almost invisible boundary between two different worlds. And as the doors opened, the sound of the city returned, distant. Traffic, a passing laugh, the rhythm of life that had continued uninterrupted. And there, just beyond the entrance, Ava was still within view, not far, walking along the sidewalk with the same calm, unhurried pace, the box held naturally in her hand as if it were just another part of her day. And Daniel paused at the threshold, the cool air brushing lightly against his face. And for a brief moment he hesitated, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that what he said next would not be about fixing a moment. It would be about acknowledging it, fully, without excuse, without deflection, and he stepped outside, the change in temperature subtle but noticeable, grounding him as he spoke, his voice carrying just enough to reach her without disrupting the space around them. "Miss Johnson," he called, and Ava slowed, then turned, not abruptly, not defensively, just with quiet awareness, her eyes meeting his again as she waited. And he stopped a few feet away, leaving enough space between them to respect the distance she had already created, and for a second the noise of the street seemed to fade, replaced by a stillness that felt familiar now, not uncomfortable, but honest. And Daniel took a breath, deeper this time, his shoulders settling as he spoke. "I was wrong," he said, the words simple, unembellished, and they did not rush out, they arrived. Steadily, each one placed with intention, and he did not look away, did not soften them with justification, because he knew that would diminish what they needed to be. And Ava watched him, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present, and he continued, "Not because of who you are, but because of how I chose to see you." And the distinction mattered. It shifted the weight from circumstance to responsibility, from misunderstanding to decision, and the moment held there, quiet but complete, not dramatic, not emotional in the way people expect, but grounded in something more real. And Ava gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as approval, but as acknowledgement of the truth he had finally reached, and she spoke softly, her voice carrying the same calm it had from the beginning. "That is the part that matters," she said, and there was no lecture in her tone, no need to explain further, because the meaning was already clear. And for a brief second, the space between them felt balanced again, not equal in power, but equal in awareness. And Daniel nodded once in return, understanding that this was not a moment that needed more words. And Ava turned again, continuing down the sidewalk without hesitation, her steps steady, her presence unchanged. And Daniel remained where he stood, watching for only a second longer before stepping back inside, the doors closing behind him with a soft, final sound that marked the end of something he could not name, but would not forget. The store settled slowly back into its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm that had filled it before, the movements quieter, more intentional, as if every step now carried a trace of awareness that had not existed earlier. And Daniel walked back behind the counter without hurry, his hand brushing lightly against the polished surface as he returned to his place. But it no longer felt like a position of control. It felt like a point of perspective, a place where something had been seen clearly for the first time. And he glanced at the display case, at the items arranged with perfect precision, their value unchanged, their meaning altered. And for a moment he simply stood there, listening, not to the store, but to the silence within himself that had replaced the certainty he once relied on. And in that silence there was no discomfort, only clarity, steady and undeniable. And across the floor one of the associates approached a customer with a softer tone than before, her posture more open, more attentive, and the interaction unfolded differently, not forced, not exaggerated, just real. And Daniel noticed it, the subtle shift, the quiet correction happening without instruction, without announcement. And he turned slightly, catching his reflection again in the glass. But this time he did not look away. He held it, studying the expression that looked back at him, not searching for what had been lost, but recognizing what had been gained. And outside, the city continued its steady motion, sunlight moving across the buildings, shadows stretching along the sidewalk as Ava walked further into the distance, her figure gradually blending into the flow of people, indistinguishable in form but not in presence, because what she carried did not depend on recognition. It existed regardless of who noticed, and she did not slow, did not pause. Her steps measured and certain, the box in her hand just another object now. No longer a symbol, no longer a statement, just something she had chosen to take with her. And as she reached the corner, she stopped briefly, not to look back, but to adjust her grip, the light catching the edge of the box for a second before fading again, and then she continued forward, disappearing fully into the movement of the street, and back inside. Daniel exhaled quietly, the breath slow and grounded, and he reached for the next task in front of him, not as a routine, but as a choice, a deliberate action shaped by what he now understood. And he spoke to the next customer with a tone that carried no assumption, no judgment, only presence. And the words were simple, but they landed differently, because they came from a place that had been reshaped. And the store, though unchanged in appearance, held that shift within it, subtle but permanent, like a quiet echo that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. And in that stillness, in that balance between what was seen and what was learned, there was something deeper than resolution, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, a truth that lingered not in the walls or the light, but in the space between people, where respect was no longer measured by appearance, but recognized without question.